So it's not often that I get to say this, but this is an advanced technology that has me pumped and fired up and has put me in that Star Trek state of mind. And I mean that respectfully. So Biotricity came across my radar screen, I don't know, about 6 months ago. And I've been tracking the RPM industry, remote patient monitoring industry, for quite some time. And some of it personalized because I have heart failure. And so I have that monitoring side of me, that interest, but also for the good of the industry.
Right.
What sets Biotricity apart from the existing solutions today? Take me through that spectrum, and then I want to unpack those.
No, absolutely. So, when you look at the RPM space, so one thing that we've seen is a lot of it is very commoditized. And what I mean by, as a commoditization is it's really focused on just general biometric collection, like a blood pressure cuff or a weight scale. Then when you go into actually disease modalities, it's very much diabetes focused. But the number one killer, as we know, is cardiac issues, even though it doesn't get the spotlight. And so you look at that aspect of it. Then to unpack it a little bit more further is that when we look at RPM, we see that you're overloading the physician with a lot of data. You haven't figured out the economic structure of it. And so the physician's like, look, I have too many patients. I don't have enough time. You're just giving me more information. How do I manage all of this? So, when we looked at all of this from Biotricity's perspective, we said, okay, how do we build a cardiac solution that follows the patient from diagnostic to disease management? And within the RPM side of things, how do we focus the physician's time on patients that actually really need it, and the patients that are stable, we summarize that information so they don't have to look at all that data, and really just focus on the events that are meaningful. So really bringing smart data to the physician.
And so I like that, because we've been irresponsibly in the medtech, health tech industry using the word data and not really stratifying the usefulness of that, right? What is actionable?
Yeah.
As we look at the biometric data that you're collecting and the way you're collecting it, so from what I understand is you're the only organization also that has developed your own product in-house, align that with your software, and that are offering a value prop to the clinician that incentivizes them to have certain behaviors, to not necessarily say, I don't want to do that because I don't have the time to digest the data, but also empowering them economically to be part of the solution. But you're co-sourcing some of that solution provision.
No, that's exactly right. So, one of the things we talk about, at the end of the day, physicians have to have both the clinical value and an economic incentive to adopt technology. And, this is where we saw the EMR adoption. Why did it take time? We had to invest and enable them. And so when you look at the RPM space, you're saying, okay, I'm going to have thousands of patients. I'm going to collect thousands of biometrics, and I'm going to get all of this information. Who's going to look at that? Well, I'm willing to look at it if it's summarized and I'm focusing on which is most meaningful, right? So they don't want to look at the data that's normal. They want to look at the data that's abnormal, or the highs and the lows. And then what's my incentive to look at that? And so Biotricity said, okay, well, here are the reimbursement codes. Let's not outsource it. Let's enable you to have staff. Let's make it economically feasible so that you can hire and grow your organization, support all of these patients, and it's clinically relevant. But most importantly, now you have freed up your time so you can actually see more patients. So we're enabling the growth of the practice while also enabling better care.
And so this is what I love to see on RPM going to this, because it becomes an unlock, right? So we're able to serve our patient, and you mentioned it, grow our business.
Right.
And that's critical, because a lot of these clinicians are looking for additional revenue streams. As I've heard more and more of these conversations saying, reimbursement is constraining me, or I have to hire more people to handle the admin load in my organization. And we're also starting to see heart teams come together, heart failure doctors, interventional cardiologists, CRM people, now having these teams come together to provide a solution. So what was the motivation was it the RPM business first, or was it the device development business first?
No, it's a great question. So we really focused on diagnostics in the beginning, right? And so one of the things that we looked at from a company perspective is we said, look, heart disease is the #1 killer, and this concept of monitoring, it's actually misused in the medical device world, because monitoring, you think of it as an active concept, right? But it's actually passive. So monitoring, generally medical devices, is let's record the data, bring devices back, download it, and then send it off for analysis. So we said, okay, let's think about this from a smart device perspective. So we're going to monitor, but we're actually going to monitor. So all of our devices have built-in algorithms and technology that can actually detect the anomalies, and then it can transmit it. So we looked at that, and then we said, okay, well, what happens to this patient after they've been diagnosed? Well, like you said, right, they get a pacemaker, they go into heart failure, and then they have to be managed. And now you have a 30-second ECG that you can personally take. And as you know, most patients are asymptomatic. So they're kind of left with nothing. And so we looked at the diabetes market and we said, well, there's continuous glucose monitoring. Why isn't there continuous heart monitoring for personal use? And so then we developed the disease management and the RPM around this concept of long-term data collection. And what's really unique that we've seen, because we've built this economic model and people have yet to understand this about our company, is our retention rate is 99%. We just don't lose customers because we've designed it to not only be clinically better for their patients, but create this economic model that supports the practice and facilitates growth.
Mm-hmm. And therein lies the key, right? Because we're all motivated by our own rewards, some of them intrinsic, some of them extrinsic, and dollars always talk.
Yeah.
And this appears like a gateway to other enabled technologies. So what have you got in mind as this moves forward? Because this is a platform technology. This is not a cute little consumerization device that exists out there today. This appears like a platform technology that wraps up the economics. It looks like it's relatively non-invasive to the consumer.
Yep.
And I'm going to use that on purpose right now. And also gives us data that's actionable. So what potentially downrange is this an unlock for?
No, that's a great way of putting it. And, you know, I always say we talk about digital health, right? But now it's just health, right? It's digital banking, it's just banking. So what we've looked at this is saying, okay, if heart is the kind of the center of the spoke, then what are the other comorbidities? So we're investigating chronic kidney disease and looking at kidney issues because 67% of CKD patients are dying of heart issues, not kidney issues. So you can use this platform and build in other sensors. We're also looking at sleep apnea and neurology, same kind of thing, right? A lot of the referrals that are coming into our cardiac network are coming from pulmonologists, they are coming from neurologists. So we're looking at some of these other spaces and saying, okay, if these patients have a heart risk, how do we intervene earlier? How can we predict or reduce that risk, right? So, same thing with diabetes. A lot of diabetics are put on aspirin just as a risk reducer. So what if we can, instead of just giving somebody a medication, give them an earlier diagnosis or monitor them earlier and see, do they really need that aspirin? Are they the diabetic patient that is trending towards, heart issues or not? And so that's how we're looking at it. And the core of that was, how do we get long-term heart data?
Mm. So you're going where I believe the future is going is let's get it way before it's even a acute disease, right? So what are you predisposed for? Well, we can do a genetic test for that. And then what are you predisposed for based upon your lifestyle? Okay, got that. Well, I can know all that, but what if I don't get an early indication that you're trending towards that? And to your point, what is it? 18% of our GDP is healthcare spend. 80% of that 18% is management of chronic disease. Yet I still don't see inroads yet to managing chronic disease outside of maybe the diabetes market. I haven't seen it in heart yet. And where can I do it where instead of in a hospital or going to my clinician, I can do it healthcare anywhere? And so this is really interesting because to your point, what is it? 60% of those with a chronic disease have other chronic diseases associated with them and leads to a catastrophic event eventually. So I love this technology. What was the genesis of this? I'm an engineer, so I'm always super interested in what was the aha moment for you that started you down this path?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, in my grad school, I did this wireless sensor work. So I did I'm an engineer by training as well. So I did a lot of work on wireless sensors and remote monitoring of environments. And so one of the ideas behind that was, okay, think of all the applications that we can, wirelessly monitor or collect information. And most of my stuff was on environmental monitoring and all that. And so, I had this moment of like, hey, I think the future is really monitoring ourselves. And I sort of, got away from that, did the big engineering thing, did investment banking, did all of this other stuff, and ended up at a company that was really at hypertension monitoring. And they got into the gamification because Fitbit got very famous at that time. And I looked at the market and I said, the future really is going to be monitoring ourselves. And so at that time, you had the Fitbits, and then you had telehealth coming up. And I looked at telehealth and I said, well, 70 cents of every dollar is spent on chronic conditions. It's really the chronic patients that need that support. Telehealth is episodic care. That's not going to work. You need biometrics. You need to monitor yourself. So that was kind of that aha moment where I saw that the industry that was saying that we're going to disrupt healthcare, I'm like, I'm not convinced. And so we said, okay, well, the future really has to be a platform. It has to be smart devices. This concept of monitoring is not going to, it has to be active monitoring. And then we looked at the heart because it's the number one killer. So the heart became the core of my focus because I saw that that is the biggest unmet need. And it's also an interesting problem. As an engineer, we think about, what is the problem and how do we diagnose that problem? And for me, the heart was challenging because you have to go across the heart, right, to get the proper signal. And most people don't realize that, right? So these watches are great, but the reason you have to hold them to collect your ECG is because you have to go across the heart. So you have to complete that circuit. So how do you collect long-term data on a patient, right? And so we saw movement in diabetes towards that, but in heart, where most issues are intermittent and asymptomatic, that's a difficult piece, right? You have to collect data over long periods of time. And that creates two issues. One is, how do you wear the device? How do you place the device? How do you make it easy to use from a consumer-friendly perspective? But then also, that's a lot of information. How do you upload that? How do you analyze that? How do you sift through that data? So we became a big data company very early on, right? People are talking about AI in healthcare. I mean, I've had a team of 15 specialists in big data and machine learning for 4 years now. So because when you're actively monitoring, where do you focus your time? What information do you really want to look at? Because most of it actually is pretty normal. It's just those little 30-second, 1 minute pieces, and you're finding a 1 minute strip in 7 days of 24 hours of data. That's your problem, not the 23 hours and 59 minutes.
So that was the genesis of that. You also have some technical advantages on the way that you capture the data, single channel versus 3-channel. Why is that waited until now to be deployable? Why is your Biotricity solution so unique? How come somebody else hasn't harnessed that?
So when you talk about 1 channel versus 3 channels, the complexity around it is really that typically when you're trying to get 3 channels, you actually need more contacts. And so there's this area of noise. How do you deal with the noise? How are the algorithms attenuation? So the simpler solution is actually a 1-channel device, and you don't have to deal with all of those other variables. On top of that, with our case, is that we've got wireless communication because we have a connected device. So that creates additional noise. So to create a 3-channel, 3-contact device, we're the only device like that in the marketplace. And we really focused in the beginning saying that, look, we want to make sure that we get enough quality of data, but without changing the form factor. Because typically when you want to do 3 channels, the device gets much larger. And so that was kind of our engineering feat through a combination of software and hardware and intelligence and algorithms to create a 3-contact, 3-channel device, get rid of the noise, and yet still be able to provide that level of sophistication. Because when you talk about the gold standard, right, when you end up in an ER, it's a 12-lead ECG. But in the ambulatory world, when you talk about heart failure patients, you talk about post-surgical, post-heart surgery patients, it's 3 channels. And so 3 channels is the best in an ambulatory because the more wires, it becomes more noise and people don't like it. So to get the best value, you really want this 3-channel solution. And so that's what we really focused on.
Yeah, and so that 3-channel solution drives ongoing utilization and adoption as well. Because if all of a sudden I got 12 wires hang off me, you're not going to get that 24-hour monitoring, which then gives you a higher fidelity data set in order to make your decisions.
No, that's exactly right. You want, when you talk about the consumer, you talk about the patient, you want the patient compliance as well, right? And that's a big thing. And that's where when we went to the consumer market and we said, okay, a patient will wear a diagnostic device for 5 days because they're worried about their heart health and the doctor has said, do this, right? But when it comes to ongoing, data collection, ongoing monitoring, self-use, the RPM space, how do you get a heart patient to be compliant, right? Are you really going to get that patient to, use their watch once a day? Maybe, maybe not. You're going to have to set a lot of reminders. You really need to give them something that they can wear and forget about it, and it has to be comfortable enough. So that's the same problem that we had, right? And yet, how do we get 3 channels within that form factor as well? So it's always that, how do we collect the most data that's most clinically relevant and useful, but then how do we drive patient compliance and usability? Because ultimately, I think some patients are generally engaged, but most patients, they'll do it if it's easy. The more complicated you make it, the less likely they are. And the more, you have to make it autonomous, right? We really try to focus on something, how do we make things autonomous?
Mm-hmm. So are we entering a point where we're pseudo-cyborgs now, right? So we saw recently this week, Musk got his Neuralink approved at least on the clinical front to take a step forward. CGM, continuous glucose monitoring, now is slid over to athletes.
Right.
And I have a wellness doctor, not a sickness doctor,
right,
who works with me, and he prescribes all kinds of things for me. And he's like, listen, I want you to start using the CGM. We can start tracking your glucose levels based upon your performances and what you're eating. I said, we'll see what happens. But now we're going to have this, and this is from a health perspective.
Right.
Obviously, this is going to be for an elite level of, and I don't mean elite in an elitist, I mean it in a small fraction of people who want to use it as a performance or wellness device. Do you see the market moving that way? And do you see rewards from the healthcare providers and from the payers to the large employers and even the individuals for using this as a data set to show that they're living a healthy lifestyle that will keep them from being a patient eventually?
Yeah, so I think it's going to start a little bit lower, and then go in that direction for sure. Because I mean, when you think about what CMS has put out, right? CMS has just put out that policy that, hey, we're going to switch over to value-based care. So the health plans are already thinking about this early on. And then we see the buzz in the industry. We're talking about Healthspan versus lifespan, right? But if we talk about the chronic patients today, if they have an event, you have rehabilitation for 3 months, then they're out of work, then they're coming back. We've avoided so many strokes. So if you can collect longitudinal data on patients that are already at risk and avoid those events, so you're avoiding the rehab, you're avoiding the cost of insurance, employment insurance, disability insurance. So I think the health plans and the employers are really going to be like, look, I want my staff to be healthy because not only are they better producers at work, but they're better for their family. They're better, just holistically, we're better. We're better as a society in general, right? And so I think they're going to enter, though, in those risk patients for sure, right? The kidney patients, the diabetic patients. And I think they're going to think about a product like this and saying, okay, I know you're at a higher risk spectrum, so let me provide this so that you can continuously monitor yourself, you can engage, you can see the impact, because we know that if we see the metric, we're more likely to act. And then when they see that and they collect that, and as we know, insurance people love their data, they'll data mine this, and then they'll realize, wait, this is actually very cost effective for the at-risk patients. Let's now look at these healthy lifestyle patients, the Healthspan patients, because if I can avoid them getting a chronic conditions by 5 years or 3 years or 10 years, just push it out. Mm-hmm. That's definitely worth it, mm-hmm. right? It's a lot more cost effective. And I think, in one way, we think about, Medicare at 65, right? So if you can get everybody to be really healthy as an employer or as an insurer until Medicare kicks in, of course they're going to do that, right? It's just naturally the way that the insurance business is going to work. But ultimately, I think, some people think of it as, the financial and the economic as, perverse, if you will, right? But ultimately, it's actually better for the individual, right? If we can keep individuals, getting chronic illnesses later. They can be healthier for a longer period of time, right? We've got a huge increase in lifespan. You got more people living to 100 now than ever before. So how can we keep them healthier without chronic conditions for as long as possible?
Mm-hmm. Maybe the pharmaceutical companies won't like that because there's less products, but that's a whole other conversation. So I want to bite into something here because I think it's relevant to what Biotricity is doing and the solution you provided. The conversations going on in the market right now around these changing centers of care.
Yep.
Right? So forever it was this large brick building in the middle of town.
Yep.
This factory we call the hospital, certainly important,
Right.
But it can't be the total solution.
Yep.
And we're now starting to see private equity invest in ambulatory surgical centers by the billions, and they're making money there.
Yep.
Do you forecast potentially a model on the changing centers of care now being these depots in the middle of town that are primarily focused on patient monitoring of the consumer, not the sick, and monitoring them in their entire environment with both somewhat invasive or at least wearables versus passive monitoring in their cars and their houses that then keeps them healthier and or identifies them? Then you can start to risk stratify and you can, I guess, sort of triage that patient or reward that consumer along the way. Is that a potential model within the next few years? Because CVS is going towards that, Walmart's going through that, and these employer-supported insurance plans. So when does that entity enter the brick and mortar of the healthcare system?
Yeah, I know it's a great question. I mean, I think we talk about, which we haven't touched on, there's RPM, and now it's moving into like this idea of population health, which I think is alongside what you're saying. So if we can look at a population and we have these brick and mortars that are like looking at the patient holistically, looking at their, car environment, looking at their home environment, collecting, and value-based care in a way opens that up because now insurance can make some decisions and take more risk, right? And say, hey, you know what? I will spend X number of dollars on something that maybe, Medicare doesn't think is useful, but I think it's useful because I want to see mobility within the home post-surgery, right? And then I think the ASC is where you go in to actually or the traditional hospital to get the invasive work done, and then you go back. So I think it's this transition between monitoring the patient and the individual holistically and seeing, are they eating healthy? Are they moving around? Are they exercising? Are they not exercising? And then there's a verification from the biometric side. And I think that feedback loop, and there's been so many studies showing that you need a feedback loop to get a patient to act, I'll use a personal story. So, I, of course, invented the BioHeart, so I was playing around with it quite a bit. And I think for 15 years, my physician, everybody says, don't drink coffee at night because, you won't get to sleep. And I'm like, well, I can take 2 shots of espresso and go fast asleep. So this was never my problem. Right. And so I totally ignored it. And then when I started wearing the BioHeart and sleeping with it and whatever, I realized that my heartbeat, my resting heart rate at nighttime was 5 to 7 beats higher. So the quality of my rest or the quality of the rest for my heart was not as good, but there was never a continuous heart monitor that could ever tell me.
Evidence-based.
Yeah, evidence-based. So of course, as an engineer, I'm like, forget it. If the evidence is falling asleep, that's not the problem here. And so now I drink decaf after 3 o'clock because I figured that out. And that type of holistic monitoring of an individual, I think, is going to keep them healthier. And I think you're absolutely right that there's going to become these centers of excellence that focus on, looking at you in your entire environment, providing that feedback, coaching you along the way. And then when you actually have an event, okay, now you'll be referred to the hospital or the ASC.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of that because when we think about our lives, we wake up in the morning, whatever time you wake up. I wake up at 4 a.m., then I go to the gym, I work with my trainer, then I have breakfast, then I have my 32-minute drive, then I'm here for, from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., and then I have my 32-minute drive home, and then I have 2 hours with my family. Well, what if I could start to identify areas in there with CGM, continuous heart rate, stress levels, and I can now see areas that now I can sort of break out, okay, that drive home, you need to get some meditation going, right? Because you can drop that, right? Your sleep, we monitored, you had things that were white, meaning pasta or bread, right? Which interrupted your digestive system while you slept. Now I can start, if I'm interested, and I gamify it the right way, I can start impacting those areas rather than, you know, one decision over a 24-hour period.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, and you were talking earlier about genomes, right? And we're looking at genetic testing and all that because, you know, let's say you have a predisposition to have fat collect in your arteries. But if you eat carrots, it's not really going to impact you, right? So, you know, if you're have a good diet, and then you can have somebody who has great genetics, but they're eating French fries and mayonnaise all the time, and guess what? They are going to get so, you know, knowing our genome is certainly great, but that environmental piece and how the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis is really what's going to drive our health span.
That's right. That's right. So what should we be thinking about, or, you know, when I look at this, let me ask you a better question. If I'm a large strategic, this is an unlock for all my portfolio. It empowers device use, it empowers data, it empowers decision making. Why are you still available on the market right now? Seriously.
Well, I think part of that is, you know, it's early days, right? We've only actually been in the market. You know, when you talk about our BioFlux, our smart diagnostic that we launched, we officially launched that in April of 2019, right? Then we launched our new Holter product, an extended Holter product, in May of last year. And now we're going into, and remote patient monitoring and the continuous heart monitoring we launched last year as well. So it's very early days because we really, for a good portion of the time when we started smart diagnostics, we really wanted to study the market, right? And people are talking about AI and healthcare, like I said, and genome sequencing and all that. We were studying all of this stuff, right? We said, okay, look, all these RPM companies are coming out, but we didn't think it was the right approach. And so we developed all of these tools. We built all our technology, as you said earlier, the platform, and really studied all of this and spent a good amount of time building that. And so now we're launching and launched all of these things just in the last, you know, year or so as the whole platform. So, you know, a year ago, if you were talking to me, we had one commercial solution, which was really in smart diagnostics, and we had $1 billion TAM. And a year later, we have a $35 billion TAM and a holistic platform to go from diagnostics all the way to disease management, to cardiac rehab, to support heart failure. And so now the conversations are very different, right? We're saying, hey, how do you keep a patient away from getting a stroke? How do you keep a patient, how do you discharge a patient post-surgery earlier? How do you support heart failure patients so that they don't have to go in and out of the clinic? And you know, that has become a very different conversation in the last, you know, 1 year as opposed to the conversations we were having 5 years ago. And now we're talking to pharmaceuticals about remote clinical trials because we know that a lot of the drug discovery, especially cancer drugs, have an impact on heart. So all of these things have essentially exploded for us in the last year, and partly because we spent a good amount of time in deep data, and because as we started doing the smart diagnostics, we said, okay, what else is going on with these patients? Mm. What else can we do to support them? Where are they coming back into the hospital? Why are they coming back into the hospital? Why are they coming back earlier versus later?
So you opened up a door. I'm glad you opened it up to pharmaceutical companies. So I often think, where's healthcare going over the next couple of years? You know, you got United, which is a $320 billion a year company, 5th largest company in the world. I don't think many people understand that. And then you've got the largest medtech company, which is $32 billion, Medtronic, right? Yeah. And then you've got the pharma companies playing out here. And then you've got the patient, you know, sitting right in the middle. Right. And as we start to get more of this data-centric information on the individual, I used to think it was going to be an Amazon, a Facebook, potentially an Apple, but I've watched them disrespect the FDA. I've watched them, none of their businesses are built on biology. Right. They don't have scientists and PhDs in-house. But neither do the med tech companies either. But the pharma companies do. Yeah. The pharma companies have access to the patients. They understand how to go direct to consumer because that's really what their product is. They have the PhDs. And now, you mentioned clinical trials. Mm-hmm. So what's the other data? I mean, are they delinquent if they don't use a device like this as they're monitoring a patient rather than looking for one outcome? But managing the patient moving forward, you now can get a subscription model on this for the lifetime of the patient instead of chasing a molecule or a patent for 7 to 12 years, and they don't even last that long anymore on the pharmaceutical side. So might it be a pharmaceutical company that comes in and says, we want this, or come in and say, no, and you're like, well, it's not for sale. But what I am interested in is a royalty revenue model, because you'll make a lot more money that way, knowing where that's going. So what are your thoughts about the future of healthcare? It's not going to be the United, because they just don't have that customer intimacy. And it's not going to be the device companies. And the pharma companies are closest to that. So do you have an opinion on where this is going to go?
I think
Putting you on the spot?
Yeah, you're putting me on the spot for sure. So I think, let's go back to what we were talking about before, where you said this middle place, right? So you talk about private equity buying ASCs. So another interesting trend that I have seen is, so we have about 2,500 different cardiologists, electrophysiologists that use our products. Their practices are getting bought. Cardiac, there's been a huge roll up in private equity investing in cardiac. And I think the next natural space is this population health piece, right? You were talking about this middle. And I think that sector has not really been created, but I actually think that's the future, right? They're going to borrow and they're going to say, this patient needs a supplement. This patient needs a drug. This patient needs this type of insurance because they're genetically predisposed to something, which means that they're going to need more engagement. They're going to need environmental support. They're going to need holistic monitoring. This patient does not need holistic monitoring because they have great genes, but they need to watch their diet, right? So I think this picture of population health and looking at patients from a disease modality perspective and grouping them and looking at not only their genomes, but also their ethnicities, their environment, the food access they have. Are they in a more rural area where they have farm to table, they have better access, better fruits and vegetables, just naturally because they're not stuck somewhere in the north where it's cold and they don't have access to certain fruits and vegetables just because of the climate. So I think that window and that group of organizations, they don't exist today. But I truly believe that they're going to get created and they're going to suck, right? They're going to suck things from us. They're going to suck things from the insurers. And they're going to suck things from the pharmaceutical companies, and they will apply these things, naturally. And like you said, the molecules and all of these drugs, once it expires, you get squeezed. The generics come in, right? So long term, you're just buying time, right? So at the end of the day, the pharmaceutical industry will certainly create precision medicines. They'll create all of this stuff, and that's fantastic. But most of care happens in between, right? When your 32-minute drive, while you're sitting at the office. And so how does all of that work? We have these movable desks say it's better to stand. Well, what if the person's predisposed to arthritis and, has a bone a problem and they're vitamin D deficient?
These are blunt force trauma advertisements, right? But you can't. So you're hitting on something here that's near and dear to my heart. Is it's a market that's not ready yet, and all this collection is an algorithm because it's deployable data. And when I go to my GP or I go to my heart failure doctor, she only knows what she knows. Yeah. But what if the physician moving forward or the clinician moving forward gets the answer from the algorithm and takes all this data in, where I live, what I eat, what I'm predisposed for, what I do every day, enter all that data in, and now the clinician is nothing more than saying, okay, the algorithm says, this is what we should be doing for you. Let's monitor it and get objective data to confer and confirm of what you're doing is working. And that's going to require a lot of trust. It's going to require a lot of sharing of personal information, right? Which right now is a major issue. It's a wall in our healthcare industry because we don't share across. But if I empower the individual on personalized care, and I can give him or her, like, yeah, you can have it all. Right. So it's a little like somebody had mentioned, it's like the credit card company. Yeah. They deal directly with the consumer, but they never really charge the consumer. They charge the merchant, right? And then they charge the bank. But in the middle there, that brand, American Express, is trusted.
Yeah.
And I think that's where this population health model comes out. And I think it's private equity who does it, because venture doesn't know what to do with themselves. And private equity builds platforms and then acquires technologies to robust and then eventually takes them public. So I think that PE world, or eventually keeps it as a cash cow or sells it to somebody, I think the PE world is going to own that population health business model that's going to be in the center of every town. And eventually will be remote, just like there's not an American Express built office in the middle of every town, but gosh knows that they're trusted. And that's why they get you early at 16 or 18 years old in order to get you, and they carry you through life. So whether it's a device or a pharmaceutical or a biotech or a food source or a supplement, they can suggest all that. And imagine having that portal into the human being.
No, then that's exactly right. And in that ecosystem, because then you had that individual for life, right? And I think that the population health piece, like, there's no, we think about remote patient monitoring, like think about the word patient, right? Population health is just saying health, right? And we think about chronic disease management. Okay, it's chronic disease. Like, these are not, great terms, right? They're not positive terms, right? And really, to deliver healthcare and Healthspan, you have to grab patients or individuals early and really treat them as, as you said earlier, as consumers. So if they're consumers, how do we engage them? How do we understand? And at that point, you're investing, right? So, the population health company will say, look, I'm going to invest in understanding your genome. I'm going to arbitrage the insurance and all of this for you and all the technology, and I'm going to become your trusted advocate, and I'm going to deliver you Healthspan. I'm going to deliver you health. And the way I'm going to do it is enabling you with technology, enabling you with data-driven approaches, and I'm going to track you, and I'm going to support your healthcare team and your providers and all of these individuals to deliver you actionable insights, but you can trust it because I came in and gave you your genome test. I came in and gave you all the technology, and ultimately what it's going to do is I'm going to keep you, healthier for as long as possible. And then when you do start deteriorating, I'm there to catch you.
And I'm there to catch you at the early onset of the deterioration, not before it's acute. And just one other thing before I ask you a final question is, this even goes further. This is where the Amazonish model comes in. So I'm an athlete. I'm 61. I train all the time. And I want to come home and I usually don't eat. I do the 16-hour fast thing. But I've been experimenting with post-workout at 4 a.m. supplements. So I would love to get on to my partner in my health and type in right there on my phone in my kitchen, listen, I'm looking for a protein supplement based on the data you have on me.
Right.
What protein supplement would be best for me, and what time of day should I take it? And by the way, you can access my Amazon account and have it sent to me tomorrow.
Right.
That, to me, is the personalization of health and empowering that health and allowing me to have, and would I pay a decent amount of money every year to have that level of acuity in the guidance on what I want to do? 100%.
No, and that's exactly right. So what's interesting, right? We think about the cost that we spend on healthcare, right? Most of that cost is once we're already acute, right? We've been diagnosed. It's way later, right? So most people are spending money on their insurance and all that, but insurance costs could go down. So if we look at it this from a truly strategic, and I think it's going to get captured, and we're going to find the worried well or the healthy, the athletes, the performance-oriented individuals that will probably adopt this type of model earlier. But then I think everybody else is going to say, wait a minute, I've seen the outcomes over there, and my neighbor, Jack, he's using it, and he looks healthier. He's lost weight. He looks, more energetic. What are you doing? Oh, well, I've signed up for this program, and my insurance has gone down, right? So I think that, like you said rightly, the PE firms can go in and really elbow around and get actually better insurance premiums and say, hey, listen, you're actually not spending more. You're going to spend the same amount, but part of your paycheck is going for your insurance, and part of your paycheck is going for this program.
For your health.
For your health, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that is exactly, that's the future. And if you can enable it, and the best thing is if we have this idea of health monitoring, that's really going to provide the feedback, and that's going to tell you. Like for me, on that coffee example that I told you, that's me. It may not affect you in the same way.
right.
Maybe in fact it's the opposite. Your body's optimized that, or your genome is optimized so that a little bit of caffeine before you go to sleep actually lowers your resting heart rate, right? So we don't know how our bodies react, and we don't have continuous glucose monitoring, continuous heart monitoring are new things. Nobody has that much data on their glucose and their heart. This is all new stuff.
And they've not connected it. We don't even know what we don't know if we were to align those data sets and then sent them out to ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And said, what do you deduce from this that we haven't even thought about? And those start to flash up. So what didn't I ask you that I should have before we finish up?
I think we talk about, you asked me about, why are we still around, and we talk about companies and how we're, expanding and things like that. I think one of the things is, for especially an organization like ourselves is, how do you scale this, right? Scale is a big thing, and everybody, and I think that's a question that is always a good one to ask, right? And one of the things that we really focused on at Biotricity for the last few years is, scale is the important piece, right? How do you, if you're getting all of this information, right? You don't want to overload the physician. You don't want to overload the patient. You don't actually want to and you don't want to overload the infrastructure. But think about it for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of patients. How does the system handle that? And so that is one of the things that we spent the last few years really building out and making sure that our technology can scale, right? Not only from a manufacturing perspective. I mean, we were backed by we do contract manufacturing, so we have the 9th largest manufacturer in the world. We have full, access to all of the right, biocompatible plastics and chips and all that. So the supply chain issues didn't really affect us. But production is one thing. The data management is another thing, right? So how do you really focus on deep data, and how do you focus on scaling all of that information? Because when you're collecting that amount of information, you have to manage it. How do you upload it, right? So knowing what the telecom companies are doing, moving to 5G. So, people look at us and they're, as a company, they're like, okay, this is a small organization, but the level of sophistication we have internally for scale, like working with the Qualcomms and the Tellits of the world and understanding how their chip works so that we can upload as much information as we can to bring it into the platform, then synthesize it and do it in a way that we can scale it so that we're not going to, fall on our feet if it's 100,000 patients or 1 million patients or 10 million patients. So that's something that we really focused on as an organization. And I think the other piece that, we talk about is how do you keep, customers, right? Because one of the things that we know in the telehealth world is patients don't stay, right? The cost of acquisition that they're spending, they're losing so many patients on the back end. And one of the things that we really focused on was consumer adoption, patient adoption, patient compliance, and we have a 99% retention rate, which is, if somebody asked me this or I was sitting in I would say, absolutely, that's not possible. But we've actually seen it, and it's because we realize that if you can support a physician, and you can support their patient, and you can deliver better care, better quality to both, while also building it based on the economic model, all you have is retention.
So is it form factor? Is it the customer service? Is it the gamification of the platform? Is it the clinician, doctor's office making the money? Is it all that?
I would say it's quite a few of those, right? I think, one piece is you have to come in from clinical quality. Like, what does this mean? Does this actually help the patient? And is it meaningful for the doctor? Because you can give the doctor the best economic incentive in the world, but if it has no clinical value, the patient is not going to learn from it. They're not going to really adopt. They don't see how it impacts their health. And then the physician is going to be like, okay, well, this is great for a while, but eventually it's just work that doesn't really provide any meaning. It's not additive, right? So really focusing on that idea of 3 channels, really looking at continuous heart monitoring, right? Collecting all of that information, creating a platform approach so that it engages both sides. That piece combined with the economic model, the usability, and all those other pieces that you said. But really, you have to start from, I would say the 2 anchors, the bookends, right? is clinical value across the spectrum for all the users. And then on the other bookend, the economic model, aligning it with the economic model. And then everything else is in between to, provide that retention rate, if you will.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I love this conversation because it's telling me where healthcare is going. Most of the devices that we look at today in the industry exclusively focus on where healthcare is today. And this introduces new players into the healthcare industry, which is what we need, because right now we have so many misaligned incentives, it's insane. So I appreciate you sharing the story of Biotricity. I'm going to be fired up to watch where you go. I love the data side. I love your own device development in-house. And I love the fact that it is answering a dire need right now in the marketplace. So appreciate your time on this.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks. Same here. I'm Joe Mullings from 160 Studios. Be well.